Welcome to this complete guide to ASP.NET Core Identity course. This course was originally published in 2021 using .NET 5 and it is just updated in 2023 to use .NET 8. In the first section, we're going to look under the hood of ASP.NET Core Authentication and Authorization without using identity so that we can have a complete understanding of how ASP.NET Core Identity works and what are the purpose of those objects that we're going to use in ASP.NET Core Identity and what are the purposes and how they achieve what they achieve. Right, so this is really the under the hood section. We're going to learn about security in general, right? And then authentication and authorization flows. We're going to learn about what are identities, what are principals, right? What is security context, and then we're going to start implement login page. We're going to generate cookies to sustain and remember who the user is, right? Remember those identities. And then we're going to read the security context from the cookie. And then we're going to learn about how authorization works in the ASP.NET Core. And we're going to create policies with claims. We're going to also implement a custom policy-based authorization scenario, which we can use to cover complicated cases. So after we understand how exactly authentication and authorization works in ASP.NET Core for web applications, in the second section, we are moving on to securing web APIs. Web APIs, instead of using cookie, typically we use tokens. So in this section, we're going to learn about JWT tokens. We're going to implement the JWT token authentication, and we're going to learn how to encapsulate claims in JWT token. We're going to implement the whole JWT token authentication and authorization flows. And then we are going to also implement authorizations with JWT tokens. In the third section, this is when we really get into ASP.NET Core Identity, but with the complete understanding of how ASP.NET Core Authentication Authorization works. It's very easy to understand how ASP.NET Core Identity works, right? We're going to learn about the essential parts of the identities. We're going to learn about what problem identity actually resolves. What's the knowledge that we have learned so far? And then we're going to configure ASP.NET Core Identity, and we started code with ASP.NET Core Identity to cover typical scenarios like user registration, right? User login, email confirmation, signing in, signing out, collecting user information. Learn about roles, as well as we're going to create user profile pages and be able to update user information. And then in the fourth section, we're going to learn about MFA with ASP.NET Core Identity. So MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. Right, we're going to learn about how it works, and then we're going to start implementing with email multi-factor authentications, and then moving on to Authenticator app multi-factor authentication. Right, and finally, last but not least, we're going to learn about external authentication providers. I'm going to use Facebook as an example. We're going to learn about how OAuth works in general, because multi-factor authentication usually depends on OAuth. Right, and then we're gonna create a Facebook application, and then we're gonna link our web application to Facebook, and we're gonna start implementing the delegation to Facebook so that we can complete our course. This course is definitely not just a theory course. It contains a lot of practice, a lot of coding. By the end of the course, you will be able to understand how exactly ASP.NET Core Identity works, what problem it resolves, and you will be able to use every single part of ASP.NET Core Identity to secure your web applications, to secure your web APIs. Please feel free to look into the course and watch all of those free preview videos. I'm very excited to see you in my course. In this video, we're going to learn about security on a high level so that you have a very solid understanding of what security really is. What are the key concepts in security, including security context, authentication, and authorization. Let's imagine this is a military base, right? There's a security guard, and this is you trying to get into the yard, right? So you go here and the security guard will ask you to show your identity, right? You cannot just say who I am. The person will not believe you. So you have to show your identity card that will actually make sense to the security guard, right? Every person have many different type of identities. You can have your driver's license, you can have a student card, you can have an employee card, but in this case, you may have to show your identities that is provided to you by the military base or by the military units, right? So once verified that your identity information is valid, basically verify that you are who you say you are, then most likely the security guard will give you a access card. Right? So let's use this as an example. Let's say this is an access card. So you will have a access card in your hand. So let's combine this together, right? So you now have a access card. And this access card contains, again, your identity informations, as well as some of the other information may be including expiry date, right? So you may only have access to this military base for a limited period of time. So then you go into the gate. Now, if you want to go into any of the buildings, you cannot just walk in and we'll check your internal identity card, this card that just was given to you, to verify that you have the permission to go into each one of these buildings, right? Because each different building may have different requirements. You have to be perhaps above a certain rank, or you have to be one of the managers of this building. Then it will allow you to go in. And when the access card expires, you would have to go out of this facility, right? Well, you have to return your card. So within this process, we have three concepts here. So the first process here is that when the security guard verifies your identity and give you an internal access card, this is a process of authentication, right? To verify that you are who you say you are, right? And then provide you with this internal access card. And this internal access card is what we call the security context, right? The security context that contains all of the information about you, so that when you carry this security context to any of these buildings, it will then apply certain requirements to your security context, right? Verify that your security context contains enough permissions to satisfy the requirements to enter the building, right? So, and this process is called authorization, right? Authorization is the process of verifying that your identities are satisfying the requirements of entering or accessing the building. And similarly, in a web application, imagine these are the different pages, and you have this login page here that is trying to, like the security guard is asking you to log in, right? The process of logging in, which is providing the username and password and verify the username and password, that is called authentication, right? And authentication also provides you the security context, right? If it's cookie authentication, then it generates the cookie, right? And if it's token authentication, then it generates the token. So you have the cookie, either the cookie or the token or something else that contains your security context. And then the subsequent request going into the page, different pages will carry the security context, either cookie or token, until that security context expires, and then it will lose your access to the entire web application, right? And when you access each one of these pages, each page may have different requirements, right? So, and that's the authorization comes in, right? The authorization process will look at your security context and then applies those requirements toward that security context to see whether your security context actually satisfies the requirements of accessing the page. If it does, then it will allow you to access the page. If not, then it will return HTTP 403 error to indicate that although you have logged in, but you don't have access to this page, right? And if you cannot even log in, then it will actually return HTTP 401 saying you're not authenticated. In the previous video, I covered a little bit about security in web application. In this video, I want to cover still on high level, but I want to provide a little bit more detail in terms of the flow. So if we have a user here trying to access a web page, right? Let's imagine this login page is already loaded because the user wants to access some information that requires login, right? So the user would interact with this browser to enter the credentials, right? So once the credential is entered, a HTTP request and then is sent to the server, right? So let's use this arrow to represent the HTTP request that is sent to the server. When the server receives the credentials from the HTTP request body, it's going to then verify against a user store to make sure the credentials are correct. Why do I draw a database symbol here? That's because the user information is stored usually in the data store, right? So the credentials need to be verified against the user's data store, right? So this step will happen. And if the verification is completed correctly, that means the credentials are correct. The identity will come back. The identity information will be used to generate the security context. So let's use this rectangle to represent this verification process. Verify credentials. And then we're going to use this second rectangle to represent the process of generating the security context. So after the verification, the identities will be pulled into the web server and store those identities in the security context and then serialize that into a cookie. If you're not very familiar with the concept of cookie, I just want to add a little bit information here. A cookie can be considered as a piece of information that is stored in the header of the HTTP request and HTTP response. Right? That information is going to be carried back and forth between the browser and the web server. And there is a feature with this piece of information because in the header you can contain lots of information, but the cookie is a special type of information because it can only be shared within the same domain, right? You cannot send a request to a different web server that carries the same cookie because there is a security problem. All right, let's go back to this authentication and authorization flow. So let's imagine this is a normal cookie authentication, which is very suitable for this web application, right? So then this serialized cookie will be contained in the HTTP response and then will be returned back to the browser. The browser will then redirect the user to a different page, right? And including that redirection, every single subsequent HTTP request will contain that cookie, right? So let's use another arrow to represent one of the subsequent requests, and then this rectangle will represent the authentication process. So you may ask why this is authentication where this is already the verification process is already authentication, right? So yes, this whole part here, both of these rectangles are part of authentication, right? to verify the user is who they say they are, and then generate the security context, serialize that into a cookie, sends that back to the browser. So this is all authentication process. Why would we have this authentication process again? Well, here we have it in the cookie, right? We have the security context in the cookie. The web server will have to deserialize that into the security context, and then the web server will actually know whether the user is actually logged in or not, right? So this part of deserializing the security context from the cookie is also part of authentication, right? So basically in one statement, authentication is the process to know who you are, right? So because the security context is already stored in the cookie, so in order to know at this step, in order to know who you are, it only needs to decrypt that cookie and deserialize that cookie because the cookie is encrypted. So once those happens, immediately we know whether the user is authenticated or not. So this is still the authentication process where we decrypt the cookie, we deserialize the cookie to get the security context. And then once we have the security context, which is actually contained in the HTTP context object, right? Once we have that information, then we can tell whether the user is authorized to access the information or the page it wants to see, right? So that's the second step, which is authorization, right? So authorization will happen right afterwards. And then if everything is okay, then the web server will decide to return the proper response that contains the HTML and all of the data that the user requires. From this video, I wanted to show you that both these steps as well as these are part of authentication, and then the authorization process is relatively simpler from at least conceptual level. In this video, I want to quickly cover the basics of ASP.NET Core, including the middleware pipeline and the filter pipeline. I would expect you have experiences with ASP.NET Core already, but I still want to quickly cover the basics just in case you need a recap. So ASP.NET Core is a platform for creating web applications that includes web APIs as well. So web applications are based on HTTP request, right? So you would have your front end and your back end, right? So you have your front end browser and your back end server. So the front end browser and the back end server is sending HTTP request back and forth, right? So the HTTP request contains a lot of information, right? It can contain information in the URL, can contain information in the HTTP header, as well as body, and other places. The request and response are basically just contains pieces of information that needs to be passed back and forth between the front end and the back end, right? The browser and the server, right? So let's zoom into the server, right? So let's imagine this part is the server, and because we want to zoom in, so we want to make it bigger. So inside this server, we have a place where we need to process the request, right? You can have one function, for example, to process the request right here, right? And just process. And then the request is processed, the response is generated and sent back to the server. The user will see the HTML, right? So that's okay, but the process itself has many steps, right? Like authentication, authorization, exception handlings, logging, routing, and validations. All those steps need to be performed, right? If you couple everything together, that go against a lot of software design and architecture rules, principles. So in order to process this in a proper way, we can apply some software design patterns, and one of the software design patterns is so-called the chain of responsibilities, right? So then we would have many functions instead of one function. We can have many functions here, right? Let's say, just call it function 1, function 3, and function n, right? So all of these can be connected together. So what this connection means is that this message will be handed to the function, for the first function, and the first function will process it, do something to that message, right? Kind of mutate that message, and then pass that message to the second one to process the message and change that message, right? And then pass on to the last one, and then return that message back, still process it afterwards, still process it and pass it all the way, and then generate the final HTTP response and send that back to the browser. And by the way, the message that I'm referring to is the HTTP context object that encapsulate both the HTTP request and the HTTP response. So this is what we call the middleware pipeline, right? This middleware pipeline kind of separates, kind of does the separation of concerns. Each middleware in the pipeline takes different responsibilities. Whereas usually the last one that are responsible to process the business logic here has its own its own pipeline, right? Because these are for cross-cutting concerns like exception handlings, loggings, right? Authentication, authorization, partially authorization. And then here, according to each different request, we process them differently, and therefore we should have another pipeline that will, according to the different requests, will process it differently, right? The second pipeline here are not handling cross-cutting concerns, but handling specific concerns for the specific request. So you would have different filters here instead of different middlewares there, right? So these functions are basically middlewares, right? So here then you would have filter 1, filter 2. I'm not writing it anymore, right? Filter 3, for example. So your request, your message will be also going through all of these. So here I want to emphasize this may not go in one by one. It may go through the first one and then go around, and then going back may not go through each one of them. It may go around. Whereas in middleware, it will go like that. But anyway, this filter pipeline has many filters connected together, and these are for handling specific requests, whereas these are for handling cross-cutting concerns. So this is the basics of ASP.NET Core, right? And once I go into coding very, very quickly, in the next few videos, I will share coding, and these concepts are important to know before that. Another very important concept to understand before I actually start coding and show you how security identity actually works within ASP.NET Core is this security context. Right? So what is actually the security context? The security context contains all the information that the user has for security purpose. That includes the user information itself, username, and all of the other type of user information like email addresses, right? Those informations are actually encapsulated within one single object that is called claims principle. In ASP.NET Core, we're using claims principle, so that's why I mentioned claims principle, but it's actually, we can say that on a conceptual level, we have a principal object that represents this security context of the user, right? It's basically, you can consider this is the user, right? And the principal contains one or many identities of the user. Why there can be many type of identities? I think I have explained in the first video that one person can have many type of identities, right? You can, for example, you can be a student and you have a student card. You can be an employee and you have an employee card. and you can have your driver's license, and you can have the access card to your apartment building. So all of these are a form of identity. And then the next level is claims. So one identity then can contain many claims. Okay? What are claims? Claims are basically a key value pair that carries your information. For example, on your driver's license. For example, this identity is your driver's license identity, right? Driver's license. And you can see that on driver's license, there is your name, right? For example, my name. And then you may have your birthday, right? Whatever your birthday is. And then you could have your height, whether you need to wear glasses while you're driving. Driver's license also contains my eye color, and as well as my address. Right, so all of these are claims. These are just examples of claims. Of course, this one claim is just one key and pair. One key pair, right? So if you want driver's license to contain all of these, then it would be like this, right? So these are the relationship between principals, identities, and claims. Again, the principal represents the logged in user. It contains all of the information that the logged in user has. And then the principal can have many identities. Usually we have just one identity, which is the default identity. And then one identity can have many claims, which carries all of the user information. And then eventually when we're doing authorization, we can use these claims. We can apply those requirements on each page or resource in our web server, right? Those requirements that requires certain claims to be present in order to gain access to the resource. Okay, let's jump into Visual Studio and start digging deep into ASP.NET Core identity. So I'm using Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition, and this is Preview 4, which supports .NET 8. And I'm going to create a project. And in the search bar, you can type in Web App, and then you can see ASP.NET Core Web App. So select this one. As you can see, it says this is ASP.NET Core Razor Pages application. This is considered as the primary traditional web application that ASP.NET Core supports. So we're gonna go with the Razor Pages application. Click on Next. And I'm gonna give it a solution name, which is going to be Web App Security. And my project name is going to be Web App Under the Hood. So this first project for us to understand how ASP.NET Core works exactly under the hood. Select your folder and then click on Next. So I'm going to select the .NET 8 preview version. Because it's a preview version, in the future, if there's anything breaks, I'm going to come back and fix it and replace the video. But currently, let's select the latest. Let's leave the authentication type as none because we want to understand exactly how ASP.NET Core identity works under the hood. We don't want to take any template that comes with already configured authentication and authorization. Click on the create button and then you will see this screen. This is an intermediate course, so I'm not going to go about and explain how everything works together. I expect that you understand the basics of ASP.NET Core web application. I'm going to come to this diagram and we'll follow this diagram back and forth along these lines so that we can investigate each and every single step. So first of all, we don't have a login page, right? But we do have other pages where we're going to send requests and receive a response. So let's examine this part first, because this part carries all of our security context. So this is the first part we're going to examine. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the pages folder and I'm going to go to the index page. This is the home page of the application. This page currently is not protected, so therefore we should be able to run it without any problems. So let's actually run debug right now. All right, so this page is loaded, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set a breakpoint. And then I'm going back to the page. I'm going to refresh the page. Now my breakpoint is triggered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add something to look at. I'm going to examine the information under the page model of the Razor pages, which contains the data construct for Razor pages, which is pretty similar to MVC's data construct. And if we say base dot, and we can see all of the data construct, and one of them is user. And if you look closely, you can see that this is the claims principle, which is the security context that I talked about in the previous video. The security context is under the user, right? Because it is the user principle. So then what is under there? And you can see that the principles can contain a list of identities. Currently, it only has one. And this is the primary identity. This identity is the primary identity, which is sort of like in the first video when I talked about when you go into the military facility, as a person, you have many type of identities. You have your driver's license, you can have your employee card, you can have your student card, you can have everything. You can even have a library card, right? But the identity that is the primary identity is supposed to be the one that is provided to you by the military, right? So this identity is our primary identity that our ASP.NET Core currently is working with, right? So if we go to that, and we do dot identity, and then we can see that it has different informations here. The main information is claims, which doesn't have anything. And the reason is that this current identity is a anonymous identity. You can see that this is authenticated member is currently false. Why is it anonymous identity? Because I haven't logged in yet. I didn't touch any login page. In fact, we don't have a login page. So in this case, we're actually logging in, quote unquote, to this web application without any identity. And this is still considered as a identity, and this identity is the anonymous identity, and that's why the is authenticated is false. So in other words, whether you logged in or not logged in, once the HTTP request goes into ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core creates the primary identity for you, right? Regardless whether you logged in or not. And if you logged in, then it will contain all of your security context, right? If it doesn't log in, it will contain a anonymous identity, which is still a security context, but it's an anonymous one. So this is the concept I would like you to understand, that regardless whether you logged in or not, you have a security context, you have a primary identity under your security context. Since in the last video, we have learned about the anonymous identity inside the HTTP context object. In this video, we're going to create a login page so that we can have an actual login identity instead of anonymous one. So let's jump into Visual Studio and continue from what we have created from the previous video. So this is Razor Pages application. Therefore, you see this Pages folder. And let's right click on the Pages folder and create a subfolder. Let's call it account. And under the account folder, we're going to create a login page. So let's right click on it, click on add a Razor page, and we're going to select empty Razor page. And we don't want to scuffle the login page because we want to learn everything from the scratch so that we know everything under the hood. Now let's click on add. We are going to name it as login and click on add again. Okay, this Razor page is created. You can see that it has a front and a back. It's based on MVC, but it gives you a MVVM view. And it's also sort of like the traditional ASP.NET, where you have a page and a page behind. So because it feels like it's MVVM and it kind of works like MVVM, one of the first things we need to do is to create a model. And in here, we are going to call it credential. We haven't defined the credential class yet, but that's fine. We can start writing it, and it's going to be a public property. So now let's define this credentials model right underneath here. It's temporary. I know it's not a good architecture, but let's do it temporarily here so that we can focus our energy on understanding identity. So we're going to say public class, and class name is credential. We need the username and the password. So Visual Studio suggested me this, and you can see it also suggests me to assign an empty value. So let's accept that. And we're going to do the second one, which is going to be the password. So password, also going to modify this to username. And here, we're also going to assign this empty value. If you go to this, click on the project node here, and you can see the project file. You can see that the nullable is enabled by default. This nullable is enabled by default since .NET 6. Because of that, if I don't assign the empty value here, then you're going to see this squiggly line, and it's going to tell you non-nullable property password must contain a non-null value when exiting the constructor. Because of that, you either use a question mark to acknowledge that you are aware that the password field can be null, or you are assigned an initial value. So in this case, we're going to assign an initial value because we are always going to have a value for the username and the password. And you can see we have a similar problem here. By having this green squiggly line, we are reminded by Visual Studio that we need to initialize this field so that we can avoid having null reference problems in the future. So we're going to initialize it right here in line. And another thing we can do about this property is to use the bind property attribute. And this bind property attribute will help us to use the credential property here to communicate between the Blazor page over here and the page model class right over here. It gives a two-way data binding field. And before we go ahead and create a markup of the login form, let's use some data annotation here to help us with form validations. So first of all, the username and the password fields are required field. Secondly, we can use the display attribute to specify that the username should be displayed as user space name instead of user name without the space. And the password, we can use data type to say that this is a password. Now we're ready to go to the Blazor page and work on creating the markup. Okay, first of all, let's go to the shared folder over here. You can see that in the layout, we have a reference to the Bootstrap by default from the Visual Studio template for the Blazor pages application. Right? So by default, we can use Bootstrap classes. So let's use some Bootstrap classes over here. Here, we can have a container because I want to give the form a border. I think it looks better, but you don't have to have this. And I just want to add a little bit of padding over here. And it's going to be 20 pixels. Okay, and then we can work on our form. This is going to be a post form. So I'm going to say post so that our username and password can be posted to the page model. And we are going to use a form group for each field. And each field is a row, and we're going to have two columns. One is a narrower column, and the second one is going to be a little bit wider. So I'm going to use column -5 so that it can be wider. And here we're going to have a label, and this label is going to show us the display name of the username. You can see that we are using a tag helper. IntelliSense knows that credential property is available because the model is defined right here. And next, we can define the actual field here. It's going to be a text field, and we can use tag helper again. As you can see, when I do this, IntelliSense knows that all of these classes are available to be used. I'm going to use the credential page model class, and it's going to be bound to the same property here. This is username. This is going to be a form control bootstrap class. So this is username, and then we're going to do the same thing for password. So I'm going to copy the whole thing and paste it over here. And this is going to display password, and this is going to accept password. The type over here, we can specify password instead of just text, so that when user is typing inside the field, nobody can see what is being typed. Okay, let's save this and run the application and see what we get. We're looking at our home page, which is the index page. And now we need to navigate to our login page. In order to do so, let's go back to our Visual Studio and let's observe the page structure. So we have the pages folder, and then we have the account folder. Under that, we have the login page. Right? So for Razor page, as you may know, that we don't actually need to specify the routing attribute or specify any routing mechanism. By default, we can just follow the folder structure. So I'm going to say account, and then I'm going to say login. So this automatically display the login. See our login form, and we can see that there's no space in between the two fields. So let's go back and take a look at our code here. We have this form group. In the documentation of Bootstrap, let's actually go to bootstrap.css over here. You can see that we're using version 5.1. In the documentation of version 5.1, we no longer need to use form group, and we should add some margin at the bottom. MB stands for margin bottom, so we add some margin over here, and then we add some margin over here as well. So this should fix our problem. In this preview version of Visual Studio, I'm having problem with hot reload. We can just restart the application. We can see our margin is added, and this is what we want to have. The username here is still username. So for that, we will need to fix something in the credential here. So instead of description, this should be name. And again, we'll rerun the application. And now the problem is fixed. After that, we will need to add a submit button. So we're going to copy this field here, and we're going to delete the actual field. We can keep the second column empty. So let's delete this. And then we can delete this label and put the input button here. So it's going to be a submit button. Submit. And the class is button, but it's a primary button. So we can use the btn primary class over here. And the caption on the button is login. And I'm gonna refresh the application. And now you can see our login button over here. So now if I click on the button, you can see the page is refreshed. So there is actually a submission. All of the fields data is postback, although they're all empty. Well, this is not what we want. We want to have a validation because the user has to enter the username and password. And for that, let's go back to Visual Studio. With ASP.NET Core, this is a pretty simple task. At the very top of the form, you can add another div, and the class would be text ginger, and we're going to use the app ASP validation summary tag helper. And here we can use either all or mode only. It doesn't really matter. And then over here, inside the second column, we can add a span. And the class here is also text ginger because we want to display error messages. And tag helper is ASP validation 4. The field is, of course, username. So this is going to help us display error messages that is related to the username field. And we're going to do the same thing for the second field, which is password. So with this, I'm going to rerun the application, and then we'll see whether our validation messages are being displayed or not. We can see that our validation is working and our error messages are being displayed properly. So I can rerun this. And now if I enter a username and a password, let's say username is admin, password is password. and I click on the login button, you can see that the data is posted back and then the page is refreshed. But how do I receive this data? Let's go to the page model over here, and you can see we have onGet. By convention, we also have something that is called onPost. Okay, and this onPost is like an event handler that receives the HTTP request, which is HTTP post request, and process that request. So let's run debug. Again, let's go to account login page and username, password. Now you can see the breakpoint is hit. And if I go to the watch window over here and type in this.credential, and let's expand this, you can see that username is admin, password is password. The form data is actually posted. Now that we can access the form data that is posted back inside onPost method, the next step is to verify the credential and then generate the security context. So we are going to do that in the next video, and I'll see you in the next one. Now that we have implemented a login page, and we have also covered where the security context is stored, we're ready to implement the verifications with credentials as well as generating the security context. So let's jump into Visual Studio and start implementing those logic. So first of all, we need to make sure that we do have our credentials. And for that, we'll need to check our model state to see whether it's valid or not. And if it's not valid, we are going to return. And then next, we want to verify the credentials. And we are not going to connect to the database. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the security aspect of that. So that's why we're just hard-coding the verification process here. So I want to make sure that username is admin and the password is password. So as long as we have these two match the username and password, then we're okay. The next step, right? So here we verify the credential, right? And then the second step here, we are creating the security context, right? And if we go back to our diagram that we drew before, we will need to create a bunch of claims, and then we'll add to the identity. We only need one identity, which is the primary identity. Once we have the primary identity, we add it to the claims principal, and we are done with creating the security context. Right? So for that, we'll instantiate a list of claims. And I'm doing Control-Dot to import the namespace here. And then, of course, we are going to let's add some claims here. Right, so we're gonna have a name, and let's call it just admin, and perhaps we'll add another one. We'll add another claim, and let's see what options do we have here. Do we have an email? Yeah, we have an email. Let's say admin@mywebsite.com. Right, that's good enough. Now that we have the claims, you know, we have mentioned the claims are just a pair of attributes, right? And with that, we need to add those claims to a identity. So now we need to declare and instantiate the identity. And what we need is a claims identity, which we can add the claims to it. And then here, what we want to have is the authentication type. The authentication type. Let's give it a name, and then I'm going to talk about this later. Right? So we're going to use cookie authentication, which is the typical type of authentication for a login page. Right? Let's call it my cookie, like my cookie authentication. Right? And you can give it whatever name you want. So once we have the identity, then what we need is a claims principal. I mean, to instantiate that, and it can be empty, but you can also provide a primary identity. You can also provide this primary identity here. So now we have this security context within the claims principle, right? We have learned that the principle contains the security context. Now what we need to do, we can see that we generate the security context, but then next step is we need to encrypt and serialize the security context, and then it can go into the cookie, right? But we don't need to do that ourselves. We can use the HTTP context object. It has a sign in async method here, which is an extension method. You can see it's an extension method. It comes from the ASP.NET Core HTTP namespace. Right, so we can do that. And here we also want to specify the authentication scheme, which is the authentication type. And we want this authentication type to be exactly the same as this one, right? And then here we can provide the principal as the second parameter, right? So we're going to put in the claims principal here. Since this is async, right? So we need to await it. And because of that, what we need to do is we'll change this to a task, and it has to be an async task. And because of that, we'll also make this one async. So this one is supposed to, what it does is that it's going to serialize the claims principal into a string and then encrypt that string, save that as a cookie in the HTTP context, right, into the cookie inside HTTP context object. And if everything is good, then we're going to redirect to a page. So let's just redirect to the index page, right? You can see that this redirect to a page, it actually returns the redirect to page result. So because of that, we are going to, instead of making this a void, we're going to make it return iAction result. Of course, here, what we can do here, we have to fix it. We can return the page result here. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to basically return the view, right? So this one is going to find the index view and return the index view, right? When we return the page result, we're returning the login.cs HTML, right? Which is the CS HTML object. And if the verification failed, then it will fall out of this branch. And again, we're going to return a page, okay? So let's build this solution and then let's run it, right? So because we did not configure authorization, that's why I did not redirect us to the login page directly, but we can go to the login page, right? And then we can type in the password. And if I type in something that is wrong, so it will return directly back to the login page, which is this one, right? But if I input the correct password, then watch what happens. It throws exception. So let's look into this exception. See, it says that no sign-in authentication handlers are registered. Did you forget to call the @authentication @cookie? It tells you exactly what you need to do here. But before we actually do this, let's try to understand what is actually happening here. Right? It says that on this line, there's something is wrong. So what exactly is wrong here? Right? Let's read this error message again. It says there's no sign-in authentication handlers. Authentication handlers. So this is the keyword, authentication handlers. Right? So what is actually happening is that this HTTP context sign-in async, under the hood, it uses the authentication handler, which is provided to this through the iAuthentication service interface. Okay, so let's take a look at the iAuthentication service interface. See, this interface contains the abstraction of several methods, right? There is this sign-in async, which is exactly the one that we're missing, right? It contains sign out, challenge, forbid, and authenticate. So these are the abstractions of the authentication handlers, right? So what is complaining here is that the HTTP context.sign async is trying to use the authentication service interface, but it cannot find any concrete implementation of that interface. So we are missing, we don't have the handlers here. And it asks you to inject, right? So this is the dependency injection ender to configure services, right? It asks you to inject the implementation of those handlers. Let's take a step back and see what is actually happening here as from the design pattern point of view, right? So let's see this, let's use this printf in the C language, for example, right? Usually this printf will print to the console, to your screen. So this is the output. The printf will output to the console. But if you use different libraries, it can go to the console, right? It can also go to, let's say, a printer, right? It can go to any other I/O devices. What is actually happening under the hood is that the printf is not talking to these devices directly. What it's actually talking to is an abstraction of the I/O devices. In C++, this would be an abstract class. So these drivers implement the abstraction. And then as long as you import the libraries of the corresponding drivers, then you are able to print to a console or printer or other devices, right? So what this printf is really talking to is this abstraction. So this kind of design pattern, this kind of design pattern is basically, it's everywhere. It's typically when you have some I/O devices. You don't want to lock your library to a particular output device, right? You don't want to, for example, you don't want to lock your output to just SQL Server database, right? By locking to a specific SQL Server database library. You want to talk to an interface and then develop all of these as plugins. So in our case, it's the same situation here. We are having a bunch of authentication and authorization. In this case, we're talking about authentication, right? We're having some requirements for authentication, and it needs to serialize the information, right? The security context to either a cookie or a token or something else. They are kind of like a I/O thing. It's outside the application boundary. It's under the HTTP protocol, right? So the security context can be stored or can be serialized to either a cookie or a token or something else. You don't want to lock yourself to just a cookie or just a token like this, right? You don't want to directly talk to it. So what you actually want to do is you want to do a similar thing, right? So inside your application, right? So let's use this this square or rectangle as a boundary for your application. Inside it, you want to talk to a abstraction, right? And this is the authentication service. This interface in C#, it contains the abstraction of all of your needs for authentication, right? So your actual authentication will just talk to this abstraction, and then the cookies or tokens, the different authentication handlers, as long as it implements this authentication service, then the only thing as a developer what you need to do is to tell the ASP.NET Core that either you want a cookie authentication handler to be injected, or a token authentication handler to be injected, or both, right? Or both. And that's where the authentication scheme name or the authentication type name come into play, right? That name comes into play because it can be this or this, right? Cookie or token or both. Because there can be multiple authentication handlers that implements the authentication service, we want to give them different names so that we can distinguish, right? ASP.NET Core can distinguish which is which. We can use the name to group the cookie, the security context, which is the principal entities, and the authentication handler itself together. And that's why we need to specify the name everywhere. And what is that name? That is the authentication scheme or the authentication type, which you have seen when I was implementing it. So let's jump into Visual Studio and see how we implement these, right? And it's actually very clear here. It's actually telling you, you need to add authentication. You need to do this. So let's copy this and let's stop debugging. And let's go into our program.cs file. Starting from .NET 6, we don't have the startup.cs file. We only have this program.cs file. And this is like a console application. And the way to configure the services is right over here. Right? It has a comment, add services to the container. And we can do it above this line or below this line. And this is the place where we want to inject our authentication handler. What we want to do is I'm going to just paste it over here, and I'm going to copy this. So builder.services.add.authentication. So we're adding the authentication handler to the service collection. And this add cookie, it means that we're adding a cookie authentication handler. This default cookie authentication handler is implemented by Microsoft. It handles the serializing of the security context. It handles encrypting the serialized result into a cookie. So we don't have to worry about implementing the encryption, decryption, serialization, deserialization of the security context. We just need to add this cookie authentication handler, and all we have to be really taking care of is to just give it a name. And over here, let's also take a look at our second parameter, which is options. So here we can configure the behavior of the authentication handler. And as you can see, there are so many things we can configure, and we're going to cover them in the near future. Right now, we just want to configure the cookie name. So .cookie.name equals my cookie auth. So this name has to match the authentication scheme and also match the authentication type here and the authentication scheme over here. By providing the name, the authentication handler knows which cookie is going to serialize the security context into, and it also knows which cookie contains the security context when verifying the credentials. So therefore, we only need to configure the cookie name for now, and we have to be very, very careful that this name, like I just said, and this name, and also this and this, they're all the same. So we can actually use a constant instead of just hardcode a string. I'm not going to do that now, but in your own development, you actually have to use a constant, just in case that you have a typo or something. By having the same name, they're logically grouped together. Okay, let's save and run the solution again. Okay, I'm going to bring up the developer tool, right, by pressing F12. And then I'm going to go to, right, clicking on this double arrow, and then I go to applications. I want to look at the cookies, right? So go under cookies, right? Open this up, and then go into this domain, right? Cookies are always associated with specific domains. So we're looking at this domain, so that's why we have to go enter this domain. And we can see that we don't have my cookie auth, the cookie name. We only have this by default. We have this anti-forgery a cookie here, right? So we don't have our cookie yet, but let's watch what's happening here. So let's go into provide the correct username and password, and then let's watch whether we're gonna have a cookie or not. All right. So you can see that we have a cookie. Right? We have our cookie, so this is all encrypted, right, and serialized. So this contains our security context, which is the claims principal. But we can't see anything because it's really encrypted within this domain. And where does the cookie come from? That comes from here. So this HTTP context.sign async is triggered, and it talks to the authentication service interface. And who has implemented that interface? That is in the program.cs, And we have this cookie authentication handler injected into the services collection. We specify the name so that when we trigger this method, it uses the cookie authentication handler that we have injected into ASP.NET Core, taking this name. And finally, we can see that claims principal security context is created over here, taking the cookie name. Okay, so let's recap. What we have done today is we input username and password. We implemented this verification process, and we implemented the generating process, right? We generate the security context within the claims principal. We injected the authentication, the cookie authentication handlers, right? And we successfully created the cookie. So the cookie is now sent back to the browser. We saw that in the browser developer tool. So in the next video, we are going to follow this line to see whether we have the cookie deserialized and decrypted. I'll see you in the next one. So in the previous video, we verified the credential here, and then we generated the security context. We serialized the security context into a cookie and sent that cookie back to the browser, right? We could see the cookie in the browser developer tool, and it looks like this. It is encrypted. In this video, let's follow this arrow to look into what this authentication does and how it does it. So I'm already from the login page redirected back to the index page, right? So let's set a breakpoint at the get handler of the index page, right? So let's set a breakpoint right here, and then we'll see what happens. I'm going to refresh the page, and then this is triggered. So let's watch what do we have for the user. And we can see that we have one identity, which is the claims identity. Unfortunately, it is still an anonymous identity, but we have already logged in. We have successfully generated the cookie. Why on earth this primary identity is still an anonymous identity? So let's go back to our diagrams right over here, and we'll see that what is really going on here. Okay, so the browser does have the cookie. And then when the browser sends another request to the index page, right, the cookie is definitely sent to the server, right? But the fact that we still see anonymous identity, it means the server didn't look at the cookie, right? So what is responsible to look at the cookie? Okay, so that's related to the middleware. Right? So this is the browser, right? So the browser sends request into ASP.NET Core, right? What is responsible for processing the request? It's those middlewares that are hooked together, right? And the request is actually encapsulated in one object, which is the HTTP context object, right? That is the object we were looking at when we were checking, we were watching here. So we were watching this base.user, right? But it's actually from the HTTP context. So if we do HTTP context, we would see the same thing. Okay, and this user would also have the primary identity, and it still is unauthenticated, is false, right? So we know that along these lines, the request actually is within the HTTP context. So there's got to be a middleware who's going to look into the HTTP header within the HTTP context and then populate the security context with the corresponding values. So, and that middleware is our authentication middleware, right? So when the authentication middleware is looking at the HTTP request within the HTTP context, it should be able to see the header that contains the cookie, and then it will interpret that cookie, and after the processing, it will populate the security context, right? The claims principal with the values translated from the cookie. So that's the job for the authentication middleware to do. The reason why the primary identity is still the anonymous identity, that's because we didn't set up our authentication middleware, right? The authentication middleware is missing. That's why it's still the anonymous one. So Now what we need to do is very simple. We just need to insert the authentication middleware in the pipeline. And to do that, let's go to our program.cs file, and then just over here where we configure the middleware pipeline, we're going to add the authentication middleware. So I'm going to say use authentication. This single line will insert the authentication middleware in the middleware pipeline. And the authentication middleware is responsible to call the authentication handler. So if we look at our authentication service interface, we can see that this authenticate async, right? We can see this is the one, right? So authenticate for the specific authentication. So this one is going to be called, and this method is going to be called and is supposed to be able to translate all of the cookie into the security context, the claims principle. So everything that this authentication middleware needs is already configured up here. We basically injected all of the services that the authentication middleware needs, including the cookie authentication handler. Right? Because we have this cookie authentication handler, we should be able to decrypt and deserialize this particular cookie. So let's run debug again and see what's going to happen. Okay, so let's go to our login page. We haven't set up our authorization yet, so I have to manually go to our login page. So we have logged in, and then if we refresh that page and then we watch the this one, we could see the primary identity, and then we notice that this is authenticated property is still false. So what is going on? We have already put the middleware there. Why it's not interpreting the cookie correctly? Well, we know that what is actually interpreting the cookie is the authentication handler that we injected into our pipeline. And it is right here. We have this cookie authentication handler injected here, but it's not working. Why is it not working? As we mentioned before, there could be multiple authentication handlers, multiple authentication schemes inserted into the services collection. So the authentication middleware will have to know which authentication handler should be used in order to decrypt and deserialize and authenticate against which cookie. And in order to do that, we have to specify the authentication scheme name, which is provided right here in each and every one of those authentication handler. Currently, we only have one, but still we need to specify this is the one we want to use. And the way to do that is just to specify it right inside here, because here is where we configure the authentication middleware, and the rest is adding the cookie authentication handler to the authentication middleware. So we need to make sure that the name is corresponding, right? So this name is the same as this name. Because the scheme name on high level, it groups the authentication handler and the cookie together, right? The cookie, by the way, contains the security context. And because it groups both of them together with the same name, so the authentication middleware knows which authentication handler to use to decrypt and deserialize which cookie. And therefore, we will have to specify the authentication scheme. And with this change, let's give it a try. All right, so we input our password. And then now we arrive at our breakpoint again. You can see the base.user contains the identity, and this time the identity is authenticated. And we can also see the claims that we added over here, which is, the name is admin, and the email address is admin@mywebsite.com. All right, finally, we're able to translate the cookie into our security context. It seems there are many things that we need to remember, but in short, we will need to remember a few things. We need to have the authentication middleware inserted into the middleware pipeline. And then we will need to configure the middleware. And after that, we will need to insert at least one authentication handler, because the middleware will have to work with an authentication handler in order to finish the authentication. And last but not least, we will need to specify which authentication handler that the authentication middleware need to work with. To do that, we just specify the name. And we just need to make sure that this name corresponds to the authentication handler name that we want to use. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. In the previous video, we have covered the authentication here, which the authentication handler is used to decrypt and deserialize the cookie so that the server is aware of who has logged in. In this video, we are going to cover the next step, which is authorization. But first of all, let's learn about how authorization works in the ASP.NET Core. So if you have a browser here and you input a URL in the browser and you want to access a certain endpoint or a certain page on the server. So let's say we have page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. Different pages may have different requirements for accessing the page, right? For example, page 1 could be allowing anonymous users to access, whereas page 2 could be a admin-only page. And maybe page 3 will only allow people from the HR department. And page 4 may be looking at, you have to be a admin, and also you have to from the HR department, right? It's a combination of these two. And maybe you have page 5 where you have for example, a online casino page where you have to be older than 18 years old, right? So there's all different kinds of requirements on different pages or different endpoints we're talking about web API. So these requirements have to be satisfied in order for the user to access these pages, right? We know that when a request is sent to ASP.NET Core server, it goes through a pipeline. After it goes through the authentication middleware, we know the security context, which contains the identity of the user, and identity contains a set of claims, right? And it's going to tell us whether the user is an admin user, which department the user comes from, what is the age of the user. So all of the information are contained in the claims. And of course, before the authentication middleware comes in, this routing middleware that tells us which endpoint it's trying to navigate to. And then the authentication middleware will be able to deserialize the cookie into our security context, the claims principals, identities, as well as claims, right? Then at this point, we know, for example, we're trying to hit page 2. Who's going to check the requirement? That's the authorization middleware. Okay, so the authorization middleware is the middleware that will look at the claims from the user and then look at the requirements from the page and then compare them and make sure that the claims satisfy the requirement. And if that's the case, then it will allow the user to access the page. Otherwise, it will return HTTP 3, right, which is a challenge, right? But you don't have the permission to access the page, although you're logged in. So that's how authorization works on higher level. But the question is, what are those requirements? In ASP.NET Core, we actually have requirement classes, and then we can group different requirements together, form a policy. So we would have a policy, and one policy can have one or many requirements. Let's use 2, for example. So we can define these policies in the configure services method within the startup.cs file, which I'll show you later. Right, we can define these policies, and then we can apply these policies by using the authorize attribute on the appropriate pages, which I'll also demonstrate later in the next video. In this video, I just want to give you an overview of the architecture of how authorization works, right? So we can define a policy which contains a bunch of requirements. So these requirements are pretty simple. The presence of the admin claim is there, then we're okay, right? If the department claim has a HR value, then we allow the user to access page 3, right? And this is basically a simple combination of two claims. As long as they're there, then we allow access to it. But then it comes to this, there is a comparison. How does the authorization middleware be able to handle this type of requirement checking? Well, we have to create custom requirement ourselves, and we have to implement the logic of handling those requirements. As a matter of fact, in ASP.NET Core, for each requirement, there has to be a corresponding authorization handler to handle those requirements, right? So basically, the authorization middleware uses something that is called Authorization service, just like the authentication middleware uses the Authentication service, right? And then the implementation of the authorization service will look through all of the requirements, right, and find corresponding handlers to handle each requirement. Actually, each requirement must have a corresponding handler. For checking the presence of the claims, there's generic ones to do the job. But if you come up with a particular requirement that needs particular logic, then you have to implement your own requirement. Let's say requirement 1 is contains a specific logic. You have to implement that authentication handler yourself by creating a class and derive that class from authorization handler to handle this requirement, right? So in this case, the policy is applied to a certain page, right, which contains a custom requirement, requirement 1, and then we have a requirement 1 authorization handler to check the requirement, and then the authorization service will be invoked by the authorization middleware, and this completes the authorization requirement checking. Once it's complete, it's going to either grant you the access to the page or deny you from accessing the page. Just to recap, after writing an authorization, we know which endpoint we're trying to hit, like which page we're trying to hit, and we have all of the claims, and then the authorization middleware will be able to check what is the requirement. It uses authorization service, requirement handler in order to check whether the logged in user satisfies the requirement for this endpoint. Because it has the identity of the login user, it has all of the claims of the user, then the authorization handler will be able to look at the claims and the requirement and then compare them and implement any type of logic that it needs to, right? The generic authorization handler is enough to handle those simple scenarios where you just say, I want this user to be admin, right? There's no logic, just checking the presence of the claim or checking the value of the claim of a certain claim. So those ones can be handled by generic authorization handler. But for specific ones with specific logics, you can implement a handler yourself. And this is the whole flow and architecture of authorization. I hope it helps. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. If not, I'll see you in the next video where we're going to implement authorization. In this video, we're going to learn about how to implement authorization in ASP.NET Core. So we have gone through this diagram in the previous video, and we know that the first step we need to do is to apply a requirement. The simplest requirement we can apply to a page is to deny anonymous users. And to do that, it's very simple. First, we need to find a page. And in our case, we have the index page, and we can use this index page. So go to the page model class here. And then on the very top, we can use the authorize attribute. And then we can do a control dot to import a namespace. The authorize attribute simply denies an anonymous identity. So now let's run our application and see what happens. Now we're supposed to see the index page right now, but it actually redirected us to the login page. What has just happened? When we try to access the index page, which is the home page, we have an anonymous identity. And because we have applied the authorized attribute, it's trying to deny us from accessing the home page. And therefore, it redirected us to the login page. So this is why we're seeing the login page now. How does it know where the login page is? Let's go back to Visual Studio and take a look at the folder structure here. So we have our login page sitting inside the account page. Actually, in ASP.NET Core, if we deny anonymous identity on our page, it automatically redirects to the login page. And the default location for the login page is under the account subfolder, and the page has to be called login. So because we have this page under this folder, right, everything satisfies the default setting. So therefore, it successfully redirects us to the login page. So what if I change the folder structure? Let's change it to account 1, for example. Then we run the application again. And now you can see that it says HTTP 404. It means that it cannot find the page, right? Because it's still looking for account login. So what if we have a special folder and we just want to put the login page inside the special folder, or if we want to call the login page differently? So in that case, we can go to our programs.cs file, and inside the authentication handler here, which is used to verify the credential, we can specify where the login page is. So we're going to say options.login path. And in this case, because we have changed to account 1, so therefore we can say /account1 login. And then let's rerun the application. Now you can see it looks for account 1 /login, and it is able to locate the page and load the login page successfully. Okay, let's change it back. So remove this and also change the folder back to account. We don't want to use account 1. Let's continue by actually running the application again and actually trying to enter the username and password. Okay, let's enter the username and password. If we enter a wrong password, it's going to come back, and let's try to enter the correct password. Click on the login button. Now we can see the index page finally. And from our cookie, we can see that we actually have logged in and we have the actual identity. So let's delete the cookie for now so that we can prepare for the next scenario. So click on delete. Okay, let's go back to Visual Studio. Next thing I want to show you is that placing a authorized attribute requires the authorization middleware to be present. So let's go to program.cs. You can see that the authorization middleware is already here, right? So after login, the authentication handler is used to know who we are. And if the user is not logged in, then the ASP.NET Core will generate an anonymous identity. And then the authorization middleware kicks in to check whether the anonymous identity is okay to be used to access the index page, right, in our example. And because in our index page, we have this authorized attribute, which denies anonymous identity, and that is why we see we are redirected to the login page. But if we don't have the authorization middleware here, let's comment it out and run the application again. And let's try to hit the index page. You can see that it throws exception. And if we read the exception, it says that endpoint or index page contains authorization metadata, right? Which is that authorized attribute. But it says, but middleware was not found that supports authorization. And then it tells you how to actually configure the authorization middleware. So it's very detailed. We can just follow the error message. So let's go back and put the authorization middleware back. The next thing we want to do is to create a human resource page, right, for the human resource department. It's going to be the human resource department's landing page. So right click on the pages folder, and then we're going to say add a razor page. I'm going to add an empty razor page. and I'm going to name it as human resource and click on add. For the markup, we can just copy the index page. We can just copy this whole thing and then put it over here. Although we don't need this learn about. And we're gonna say, welcome to human resource department. What we want here is to only allow people who belong to the human resource department to be able to access this human resource landing page. We can use a policy for that purpose. To do that, let's go to program.cs file. And we know that we have this authorization middleware. And in order to add a policy, we will need to configure the authorization middleware. So under the authentication middleware configuration here, we can say builder.services add authorization. And then inside here, you can see that there are different signatures. This one is an action. So we can use lambda expressions. We're going to say options goes to. And here we can say options dot add policy. And we're going to add the first policy, which is must belong to HR department. So this is the name of the policy. And then we are going to actually specify what is the requirement of the policy. So here, again, we're going to use lambda expression, right, to say the policy goes to policy require claim. And the claim type, which is the key, is department. And the value is HR. So we're basically requiring a claim that is a key value pair, which the key is department, value is HR. It means that the person actually comes from the HR department. Only when the person comes from HR department do we allow the user to access the HR department landing page. Okay, let's close it with semicolon. And now we're ready to use the policy on the human resource department landing page. And to do that, let's go to the human resource department page, go to the page model class, and we're going to apply the same attribute as before, which is authorize, right? Automatically, the namespace is imported, but only this time we will need to specify the policy. And you can see that this is a string, which is we have already specified, which is must belong to HR department. You can call it any name you want, but by specifying this name, the authorization middleware will look for the registered policy, which is over here, and it will see the policy, and then it will see that the requirement is to require the logged in user has a claim whose key and value match what is specified here. Currently, if we go to our login page, go to the page model class, you can see that we only have the name and the email claims. So if I run the application right now, let's run the application and let's log in. Click on the login button. Now let's go to /human resource. And now you can see that it redirected me to the /account/access denied. So what it's actually trying to tell me is that we're not actually allowed to access the page. And therefore it's try to redirect me to the access denied page, but it couldn't find the access denied page under the account folder. Therefore it gives me a HTTP 404 error. The actual error is 403, which is challenge, right? But because it couldn't find the access denied page, therefore it's giving me another error. Again, you can see that it knows where the access denied page is supposed to be by default. And if you want to change this, you can go to program.cs file, and here under the authentication handler here, you can specify access denied path, right? I'm not going to do that, but if you want to specify the page in a different location or give it a different name, then yeah, you can specify it over here. But let's do that under the account folder, right click up, on the account folder, click Eraser page, and the name of that page is going to be just called access denied. Click on add. Now we have access denied page. And inside here, we're just going to create some markup, and we are going to give it a title. It's just going to be called access denied. And I want to add a line break. And here, I'm going to just spit out a message. So you don't have access to the page you are looking for. Okay, with this simple change, let's rerun the application and see what happens this time. Okay, here, let's check the cookie. We still have the cookie over here. We don't have to log in, right? Because cookie hasn't expired yet. That means that the server knows who we are when we try to access any page. So let's go to the human resource page, hit enter. Now it redirected me to the access denied page. We can see the information properly. Then how do we actually gain access to the human resource page? It's actually pretty simple. Let's go to the login page over here, and we can add another claim. So new claim, and the type of the claim is just going to be department, and the value is HR. And this has to be exactly the same as what the policy is looking for. So you can see department and HR, right? Don't have any typo. And if we run this application again now, and let's go to human resource and hit enter, it's still redirecting me to access denied page. Why is that? Because we're still reusing the previous cookie. In that cookie, it does not have the new claim. So currently we don't have a logout page, so it couldn't remove the cookie. So let's just right click on it. And for now, just manually remove the cookie. And then let's go to the home page and enter admin, password, and login. Now the admin user has logged in, but this time it has a new claim, which is the department claim, and the value is HR. So therefore, when we access human resource page, I expect myself to gain access to the human resource department. You can see that we can see the message, and we are accessing the human resource page successfully, finally. What if in a scenario that we just want to check the presence of a particular claim? So let's come up with a scenario. Let's create a settings page, right, under the page folder. And we're going to create a Eraser page, click on add, and I'm going to call it settings. So this settings page is only accessible to users who are admins. So I'm going to say authorize, and the policy is admin only. We haven't created this policy yet, but we're going to do it now. Let's go to program.cs, and let's add the policy on the top, because the admin policy is most likely the first one that comes to our mind. So again, the name has to match, admin only. And the policy is policy dot require claim. And you can see that this has a signature which only specifies one parameter, which is the key of the claim. It's also called claim type. And let's just call that claim admin. Okay. The next step is let's go to account folder and go to login page. Over here, I'm going to add another claim. And of course, the key has to be admin, and the value can be anything. It doesn't matter. So let's just use true. Okay. With this setting, let's run the application again. And again, we still have the cookie over here, and this cookie doesn't contain our new claim. So we will have to manually delete it for now. And then let's go to home page again, try to log in. When we log in this time, the cookie that is created here, you can see this one will contain the new claim. And let's go to /settings. And now you can see that it didn't redirect me to the access denied page, and therefore our authorization works. Let's add some contents to our settings page. So we can copy what we have in the Human Resource Department page. And let's copy this over here, paste it over here. And let's just call this settings. And this time, before we run it, let's comment out this. So therefore, we don't have access to the claim. And let's see what happens this time. But before this cookie is deleted, you can see we're seeing this title over here, right? But if we delete this cookie and try to refresh the page, it takes me to the login page. I'm gonna enter the correct username and password, and now try to access the settings page, and it says access denied, right? Because we have commented out the new claim. For the next scenario, let's create another page, and this time let's call it the HR manager page, and let's add something over here. So welcome to human resource management. Okay, and for this page, let's go to the page model over here and specify the authorized attribute. And for that, the policy is going to be called the HR manager only. And let's go to program.cs and specify the HR policy, HR manager policy. So the name has to match. Let's go back over here, make sure they match by copy and paste. And configuration is policy goes to policy. And here we are going to require a claim. So basically the same thing here. So first of all, the user has to belong to the department of HR. So therefore, we're going to use the same requirement. And after that, so let's do this. After that, we can chain another one. And for this one, I'm going to say manager. So I'm going to require the presence of the manager claim, right? And from here to here is a AND relationship. So this means that the authorization middleware requires this requirement to be satisfied, as well as this requirement to be satisfied. Okay, let's finish this. And currently, we already have this department claim here. We just don't have this manager claim. And if we run this application right now, it should take us to the access denied page. And let's verify that. Okay, you can see that cookie is still there. So therefore, we don't have the new claim yet. And let's go to the Human Resource Manager page. Let's actually copy the name of the page and paste it over here. And now you can see that takes me to the access denied page. And that's because I haven't added the new claim. And let's go to program.cs file once again. You can see the new claim that we're looking for is manager. So I'm going to copy that just in case I sometimes have a typo. And the type of that is manager. Here the value doesn't really matter, so I'm gonna still use true just to make it make sense. And now if I rerun the application, I'm going to delete the cookie now, go to the home page, enter the correct username and password, and now try to go to the HR manager page, which is listed right here. Click on it. Now you can see welcome to human resource management. So we are able to access the page successfully with the chaining of two different requirements representing a AND relationship between the two requirements. We have seen this cookie a lot. Every time we want to simulate logging out, we have to manually delete the cookie. So before we go any further, let's actually implement the logout functionality so that the cookie can be automatically deleted. Let's go into Visual Studio. If we go to our login page, you can see that we have this sign in async, which is used to create the cookie and use the cookie to wrap around the security contact. For deleting the cookie, similar to sign in async, we have a sign out async. So we are going to use that to implement the logout functionality. We will need a logout page, and inside the logout page, we're going to use the HTTP context.signout async. So let's go ahead and add a logout page. We're going to add the logout page under the account folder, and I'm gonna add a empty Blazor page, and let's call it logout. For this page, we don't actually need any HTML markup. We just need to implement the functionality in the page model class here. And we don't even need a onGet method. We just need to implement the onPostAsync because we are going to use signout async method. So therefore here, I'm going to use async task. And because we're going to use a redirect to page, therefore we need to have a return type. And here, we're going to use HTTP context and signout async here. And you can see that this method takes the scheme name. So we will need to make sure we specify the correct scheme name. So we can go to the login page, copy this. By providing the scheme name, ASP.NET Core knows which cookie to kill. Therefore, it's very important to have this scheme name spelled correctly. The best practice is to create a constant, but I'm not going to do it in the course. I highly suggest you to create a constant so that you don't have a problem with typo. Here, this is the async method. We're going to use await. And then we're going to redirect to a page instead of action. So action is for MVC. Redirect to page is for Blazor pages. And we're going to redirect to the indexed page, which is the home page. Another thing I want to remind you is that the home page, which is the index page, is protected. So anonymous identity will not be accepted. Okay, so now that we implement this somewhere, we have to trigger this method. For that, we will add a login or logout button over here. This is the place where we want to display a logout button. When user clicks on the logout button, we have to trigger this onPostAsync method. And for that, let's start with creating a partial view. That partial view will wrap around the markup for the login and logout button, depending on the status, whether the user is authenticated or not. For adding a partial view, I'm just going to copy this partial view and paste it over here. Then I'm going to change the name to underscore login status partial. And of course, inside here, we don't need these scripts. We need some logic here. So we're going to say if user is authenticated, in this case, we're going to display a welcome message along with a logout button. Otherwise, we're going to display a login button. So that is going to be an anchor and looks like a button, right? But it's a link button. When the user clicks on that link, we go to which page. So this is the tag helper. Help us to navigate to the login page. And the caption is login. Over here, the green squiggly line is basically just saying that the user could be null. So we can say if the user is null or user.identity is null, or so this way we can get rid of this green squiggly line. So the green squiggly line is basically just reminding us to do null checks so that we can avoid a lot of null reference problems. That's the purpose of enabling nullable in the project file right here. By default, it's enabled. Come over here, we're going to create a form. And it's going to be a post form. The reason why we need a form is because our logout page that we created over here has a onPostAsync method, and this onPostAsync method is only going to be triggered when the user posts a form. So therefore, we create this form, and the form is going to be a inline form. And again, we're going to use the ASP page tag helper to help us post to this particular page. First of all, here, inside here, we're going to display a welcome message. we're gonna say user.identity.name. Again, it has a squiggly line, so for this one, we can use question marks. And then we're gonna display a button. The type of the button is submit, so that the form can be submitted. And we're gonna have some margin here, so margin left, a little bit margin. And again, it's going to be a link button. The caption is Logout. Okay, so we completed this partial view, and we need to use the partial view somewhere. And that place is in the layout file. So in the layout file, go to the bottom. We are going to add it over here. I'm going to create a div. And I'm going to add a margin right because we want to align that to the right. And I'm going to say partial name is login status partial. Again, this is a tag helper to help us to render a partial view. The name is underscore login status partial, which corresponds to the one that we just created over here. Okay, let's run this application and see what happens. Now you can see the logout link button over here because it sees we have a cookie. And when we click on this logout button, what happens is that there is a form over here. When you click on it, the submit button over here will be triggered and the entire form will be posted to the logout page. And when we go to logout page, we can see that this method will be triggered and the sign out async will be triggered. The sign out async will look at the parameter and it knows which cookie to be killed. You can see that this cookie name corresponds to the scheme name. So therefore it will locate this cookie and get rid of this cookie. And by doing that, the user is logged out. So let's click on it and see whether it works or not. Okay, so it worked. Why do we see this page? That's because over here, once the sign out functionality is completed, the code redirects us to the index page, which is the home page. And remember, I have pointed out that the home page, right, which is the index page, is protected. Therefore, we are redirected to the login page over here, right? So now let's log in again just to make sure everything still works. So we logged in, we're seeing the home page, everything still works. Logged out again, we're seeing the login page. And as you have noticed that every time we click on the logout button, the cookie here is removed. And every time we log in, let's try to log in again, the cookie is added. Try log out again. You can see immediately the cookie is deleted. Because the cookie is deleted, we don't have the security context anymore. The user that is using the application is having the anonymous identity. Therefore, the application knows that the user is anonymous and kicks the user out to the login page. Okay, this is the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one. 2 videos ago, we have implemented simple authorization policies where we were simply checking the existence of a claim or specific values of claim. In this video, we are going to implement some more complicated scenarios where we're checking some custom logic other than just checking the presence of a claim or the specific value of the claim. So let's imagine a scenario where you are hired as a human resource manager, and you can access, of course, you can access human resource manager page, whereas the permission is only given when you pass your probation period, right? So for example, you have a 3 months probation period, and within the 3 months, although you're given the main claim and HR department claim, you still haven't passed your probation period, you won't be able to access the page, right? So that's going to be a custom requirement, which we're going to implement. And then we have to implement the authorization handler to help us to handle the requirement. And then in the handler, we can say whether the security context satisfies the requirement or not. Okay, so let's jump into Visual Studio and get started right away. First, let's go to the login page. And here, we will need to add a new claim. And the type of that claim is employment date. the value of that, let's say 2023-05-01, that's May 1st, 2023. And then let's go to Solution Explorer here, and let's create a new folder, and let's call it Authorization. We're going to put all of our customer requirements under the Authorization folder. And for now, we only have one. So we're going to create a new class, and let's call it HR Manager Probation Requirement, and click on Add. Any custom requirement has to implement the Authorization Requirement interface, which is right here. If we go to the definition of this interface, you can see that it's actually empty. And the reason why it's empty, I can show you a little bit later. But for now, you just have to know that any custom requirement will have to implement this Authorization Requirement interface. After that, inside the class, the first thing we want to do is to create a constructor. And the parameter that is passed into the constructor is going to be the probation month. So we can use this to configure the requirement of probation period. So how long the probation period should be. So doing the control dot to create and assign a property. Okay, after that, we are going to create a requirement handler. And that requirement handler is going to handle this particular requirement. Therefore, we are going to copy the name of this requirement, and then we're going to create a new class. And we're just going to call it HR Manager Probation Requirement Handler. And for any handler, we'll need to derive from the Authorization handler over here. And this here requires a generic type here. And you can see that this generic type is a Authorization requirement. And that's the reason why we want our requirement to implement the Authorization requirement here. So I'm going to copy this and paste it over here. And now you can see it has a red squiggly line. This is because this particular class is an abstract class. So I'm going to do a control dot to implement the abstract class. And automatically it generated this method here. It means that this method is overrated. And you can see that the requirement is passed in. Inside here, we just want to handle the requirement. Here, we want to get two things. We want to get the probation month, which we can get from the requirement. And secondly, we want to get the user information, right? The user claims that contains the employment date, so that we can compare the two things and see whether the probation period is satisfied or not. To get the employment date, you can see that we have this authorization handler context, and from within the context, we have this user property here. And from user, we can use the has claim to see whether we have the employment date claim, right? So we can say x goes to x.type, so this is the key, equals employment date. So I want to say that if user does not have the employment date, we are going to return task.completed task. This doesn't mean it succeeded, because if we want to succeed the requirement, we have to specifically use the succeed method, which we're going to use right after. So here, we need to get the employment date. And for that, again, we need to access the user property. And then I'm going to say find the first, x goes s2, first claim, whose type is employment date. What we can do here is that we can use if datetime.try parse, and we're going to parse the claim, which is this one. So this is the claim question mark dot value, and it's going to be an output parameter. It's going to output to a employment date, right? So if this succeeds, then we can continue with our logic. Otherwise, we're just going to return task.completed task. And the logic here is that we first got the period, which is datetime.now minus the employment date. And if the period.days, you can see that this period is a time span. Right? So if this is greater than 30 times requirement, which is this parameter, requirement.probation months, which we configured over here. This is the property within the requirement. And then we're going to make it succeed. So we're going to say context.succeed. Which requirement are we succeeding? It's this requirement. Okay, so we have our requirement and we have our handler. The next step is to go to the program.cs. So control, comma, program.cs. Here, we need to register the requirement and the handler. We already have the HR manager policy here, and this HR manager policy is already being used on the HR manager page. You can go to the page model class here. You can see that this policy is already being used. All we have to do is to add the new requirement to it. So for that, we are going to chain this and we're going to say require. And here, instead of using require a particular requirement, we're just going to say requirement, and we're going to add a custom requirement, and that is our HR manager requirement. And we're going to pass in the probation month as 3. So you can put this in app settings. Here, I'm just going to hard code it here, and then I'm going to close it with a bracket. So now you can see this policy is amended. There is an and relationship between each one of these. So we added the new requirement. That means the person can access the HR manager only page only when the user belongs to the HR department and has to be a manager and also has to pass the probation period, which is 3 months. Another thing we need to do is we need to dependency inject the requirement handler. So for that, we're going to say builder.services.add singleton. You can use add transient. It doesn't really matter, but use singleton will improve the performance a little bit. So authorization handler, and it's going to be the HR manager probation requirement handler, and that's it. So we have our requirement added to the policy, and we registered our requirement handler. Before we give it a try, we want to add the HR manager page to the menu. And for that, we can go to the shared folder, go to the layout. Here, just above the privacy, we can add the HR manager page. So it's going to go to the HR manager page. So I'm going to copy this, go back to layout, and put it over here. And then I'm going to say HR manager. Again, coming back to this diagram, just so that we know exactly what's happening. So if we're trying to access this HR manager page, right, the authorization middleware will grab the policy name, and then it will go through all of the requirements and find their handlers, right? Because we have this handler specified to handle that specific requirement. The requirement is over here and the handler is over here. Therefore, the authorization middleware will be able to see this requirement and find its corresponding handler because we have this association right here, right? So this requirement is associated with this handler. So the authorization middleware will be able to know that this handler handles this requirement, and therefore it's going to execute this method. And then let's run the application and see what happens. We have our HR manager page here. If we click on it now, it just redirects to us to the login page. So I'm going to log in as admin password, click on login. Okay, now let's go to HR manager page. It says access denied. Why is that? Let's go to the login page here. We can see that employment date is May 1st, but today's date is July 25th, 2023. Right? This is not 3 months yet. So maybe let's change that to January 1st. So that is way more than 3 months. And then let's rerun the application and see what happens. First of all, let's log out in order to kill the cookie and then log it back in. So when I do this, the cookie should contain the new employment date, which is January 1st, 2023. And that makes me pass the probation period, and I should be able to access the HR Manager page. So let's click on it. Now you can see I'm welcomed to the Human Resource Management page. So in this video, we have implemented this custom requirement and the custom requirement handler. So you can have pretty complicated requirement, and then all you have to do is just implement this authorization handler to handle the specific requirement. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. So once the login process finishes here, a cookie is generated as a authentication ticket. The cookie may or may not have a expiry date and time. As developers, we have the power to choose to set the expiry date and time or not. Okay? And that expiry date and time is also affected by browser session. So in this video, we are going to talk about the lifetime of a cookie and how it's affected by the browser session. Like I mentioned, as developer, we have the power to control the lifespan of the cookie. And the way to do so is to come to our program.cs file and find the cookie authentication handler, and our configuration is right inside here. So options.expire timespan, and then we can use timespan from minutes, from seconds, from hours. For testing purpose, let's use from seconds, and let's say 20 seconds. And then we can see how it affects the behavior of our application. So let's run the application. Okay, we're at our login page. We just log in and we are logged in. So if we watch the time here, 40, so let's wait for 20 seconds. Okay, 20 seconds has passed. So if I refresh the home page, you see I'm kicked out. And the reason why I'm kicked out is that the cookie has expired. So if we look at our cookie, it is here, but there is some information inside the cookie that specifies the expiry date of the cookie. So therefore, we're kicked out from the application. What happens if we close the browser before the cookie expires? Let's give that a test and see what happens. So instead of 20 seconds, I'm going to put 200 seconds. And then I'm going to run the application again. All right, so I'm going to log in. And now you can see that I have a cookie. And if I close the browser and open the browser again, you can see that our cookie is cleared, right? Although the cookie hasn't expired because 200 seconds hasn't passed yet. So how is browser session affects the lifetime of a cookie? So let's talk about that now. First of all, what is a browser session? Right? A browser session is basically an interaction between the browser and the server, right? So the browser session lasts as long as the lifetime of the browser. So as soon as you close the browser, the session is finished. So that's the browser session. So if we draw two bars, right, the first bar represents the lifetime of the cookie. The second one represents the lifetime of the session, browser session. So how is the browser session lifetime affects the cookie lifetime, right? So if the browser's lifetime is longer than the cookie lifetime, basically it does not affect the cookie's lifetime. The cookie will expire when the time comes, right? At this moment, it will expire. If the browser session is shorter than the cookie lifetime, of course, so the cookie's actual lifetime is right here, right? Because the browser is closed, the cookie is gone, right? But there is an exception where you as a developer can set the cookie as a persistent cookie, which means that the cookie will survive the browser's closing. Right? So even when the browser is closed, the cookie will still stay there. So this is called persistent cookie, right? A persistent cookie will always have the lifetime as you set for the cookie. Let's say the browser is closed here, and then after some time the browser is open again. This time the session is a little bit longer, the browser session is a bit longer. The cookie will still expire at this moment right there. So how do we set a cookie as a persistent cookie? You have all experienced the login screen where you see there's like keep me signed in or remember me checkbox. When you check that checkbox, then the cookie becomes a persistent cookie. Let's go ahead and implement that. So let's go to the login page here. First thing, we need a variable to receive that remember me setting. So it's going to be a property here in the credentials model, and the type is a boolean. So remember me. But we want to display that, so we need to have a better display name, and the name is going to be just remember me with a space. And then we're going to add this field in the front end. So go to login markup. We're going to copy this row and paste it above it. And over here, the form is for checkbox. So therefore, we're going to use this class. And here we can change this input to a checkbox input. You can see that. And the class is going to be form-check-input. And we don't need a value here, but of course we need data binding. So this is for the credential dot remember me. Okay, after that we need a label for the checkbox. And the class for that is also form-check. The IntelliSense sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. And the data binding for that is, well, it's not data binding, but this label is for credential.rememberme. And let's close this. Okay, so now we have this front end. And when user is input the value, it's going to be posted over here. Right, and this variable is going to receive that, and we can get the value from the credentials object here. And the way to use that is to use that inside the sign in async method, because it has a third parameter here. You can see that the signature has a third parameter where we can specify whether the cookie is a persistent cookie or not. Okay, so we're gonna have a variable defined here. So authentication properties, and it's going to be a new authentication properties. And in here we have this property, and we can assign credential.rememberme to it. So when user is checking the remember me, we want to make the cookie a persistent cookie. A persistent cookie will survive the closing of the Blazor session. We can use the property as the third parameter, and when the sign-in async method is creating the cookie, it will check the authentication properties, and it will see whether the cookie is persistent or not, and it will create the cookie accordingly. So let's give that a try. And before we do that, let's go to program.cs. Let's confirm that we have a long-lived cookie, at least something that is enough for us to test. Let's run the application and give it a test. Okay, so now let's log in. And the first time, I'm not going to check the remember me. I'm going to just log in. And as you can see, we have this cookie over here. And remember, it's a 200 seconds lifespan cookie. So I'm going to just close the browser. And when I open it, I'm going to expect that I'm logged out because I did not check remember me. So run the application again. You can see that the cookie is deleted. So now let's try that again, but only this time we will make it a persistent cookie by checking the remember me, clicking on login. So I'm logged in. And this time, let's close the browser. So this is well within 200 seconds. Close that and open it again by running the application again. So now you can see I'm not asked to log in. So this is the power of having a persistent cookie. That means the cookie is able to survive the closing of the browser session, and therefore he doesn't have to log in again. Okay, let's log out. Another thing I want to mention is that although the user checked the remember me checkbox, it does not mean that the cookie will always live. It is still subject to the expiry time span setting over here. So let's make this 20 seconds and give it a test. So run the application and let's log in. and I'm going to check this remember me. I'm going to log in and I'm going to start counting 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to close this. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to run this again. 13, 14. You can see this still within 20 seconds. So I'm here. So now it's maybe 18, 19, 20. And now I'm going to refresh the page and I'm expect myself to be kicked out, right? Because as I said, the cookie, although it's persistent cookie, it's not going to survive expiry time span. So refresh and I'm out. Check the cookie here, it's deleted already. So hopefully this video is helpful to help you understand the relationship between the cookie lifetime and browser session lifetime. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And if not, I'll see you in the next video.